Stories have always been a means for us to examine our hopes and fears. One genre that does this in particular is Gothic fiction, which specifically deals with the uncertain nature of being human, as it invites us to examine the best and worst that we have to offer. While the current pop cultural landscape still offers many of its influences to this genre of fiction, one particular story offers up one of the best modern representations of this genre in recent memory. How strange is it then that such a dark genre would be so well represented by a cartoon for children? Over the Garden Wall is an animated miniseries by Cartoon Network, which has some of the most compelling storytelling and characters to grace animation in recent years, much attributed to its relationship to classic Gothic fiction. So, come join me, as we will closely examine one of the most brilliant pieces of modern animation and its relationship to classic Gothic storytelling, as we both travel into the unknown. Before I can really go in depth with this series, I will need to define some things that go into the makings of a Gothic story. Generally, in order to be considered a piece of Gothic fiction, a story must include the following. First, it must have its characters going on a journey that is both internal and external. Second, a melodramatic and morally ambiguous story, usually evoking a previous time period relative to when the narrative was created, all the while constantly evoking dark or supernatural elements. And finally, it must occur within a sublime setting that is often personified. We will go into each one of these elements in more detail later, but for now, I would like to go into this narrative element first. Over the Garden Wall is the story about two brothers, Wirt and Greg, who are trying to find their way home from the unknown, a strange forest where long-forgotten stories are revealed to those who travel through the wood. While the brothers' journey remains the most important part of the series, a large amount of focus is placed on the smaller short stories which present themselves on their journey. When Patrick McHale was originally pitching the series to Cartoon Network, he wanted these stories to have a fairy tale-like quality to them, almost as if Wirt and Greg were witnessing stories that were lost to the ages. I had the pleasure of being able to interview Nick Cross, the art director of short programs at Cartoon Network and the head art director for Over the Garden Wall. And when discussing the fairy tale-like nature of this show, he had this to say. Over the Garden Wall was very much meant to be a modern fairy tale. The art style is meant to seem like something from another time, and the fact that the characters are lost children in the woods, witches, ghosts, wolves, and woodsmen is on purpose. I think those types of stories really resonate with people, especially when you want to make it a slightly scary story for kids. This classification as a modern fairy tale is very important when considering the show's relationship with classic Gothic fiction. Because many original fairy tales from the likes of the brothers Grimm and Hans Christian Andersen share the same elements of Gothic fiction, to the point where many say that they are one and the same. In an academic paper, The Motifs and Moral Ambiguity in Over the Garden Wall, writer Christiana Wilsey writes how Over the Garden Wall's status as a modern fairy tale allows it to reside in the dark ambiguity of Gothic storytelling, while at the same time allowing it to remain appropriate for children. Like Gothic fiction, traditional fairy tales have morally ambiguous narratives with often dark and disturbing elements, all for the purposes of teaching some sort of lesson to the younger generations. While modern interpretations from the likes of Disney and Shrek have abandoned this ambiguity for the sake of marketability, Over the Garden Wall revels in this ambiguous dark nature that fairy tales were previously known for. As an example, take the 7th chapter of this series, The Ringing of the Bell. It is here where Wirt and Greg come across Lorna, a young woman who lives under the supernatural control of her monstrous caretaker, Auntie Whispers. Wirt, falling in love with Lorna, decides to help her escape her aunt, only to find that Lorna was possessed by an evil spirit who devours all who try to help her. And to make sure that the twist would not be lost on younger audiences, Greg immediately spells it out.
Oh, for some reason I thought that old lady was the people eater, but it was Lorna all along. It just goes to show you stuff.
In the end, Wirt and Greg are able to banish the evil spirit and save Lorna, and she decides to stay with Auntie Whispers, who only wish to protect her. This episode captures all of the gothic elements that come with being a modern fairy tale. It uses the iconography of stories like Cinderella, Hansel and Gretel, and Snow White. In such stories, it is often the job of the hero to rescue fair maidens like Lorna from their monstrous caretakers. Though, as it turns out, there are no monsters, and neither Lorna nor Auntie Whispers can be considered truly evil. Likewise, despite their good intentions, Wirt and Greg do very little to be considered heroes in this story, leaving us, the audience, with very little distinction between who is a hero or villain. And that is the core identity of Gothic storytelling. As a general rule, Gothic stories often reside in the realms of moral ambiguity, where the characters are often not easily placed within categories of good or evil. It might begin with characters inhabiting archetypes in order to create a classical set of expectations where heroes and villains are obvious, but more often than not, this will be put into question as time goes on, as we begin to see the noticeable flaws within our heroes and learn to empathize with our villains, which has ironically become a new set of expectations for those who are familiar with the genre. And while this is sort of the case with Over the Garden Wall, it is often revealed that many of the monsters and evils that Wirt and Greg encounter are in actuality benevolent, if not actually good. Creatures like the wolf monster, the citizens of Plattsfield, the gorilla, Quincy Endicott, Auntie Whispers, and the woodsman are all set up to be classical Gothic villains. The monster in the woods, the hive-minded mob, the savaged, untamed beast, the murderous conman, the cannibalistic witch, and the man in exile from society, each one appearing to be menacing to anyone at a first glance. Though upon further inspection, these apparently villainous characters will only be outwardly evil-looking, revealing them to have more complexity behind them than one might be led to believe.
Creating a morally ambiguous narrative often relies upon subversion, creating a certain set of expectations and viewpoints for your audiences, turning them on their heads, and causing your audiences to question those very same expectations and viewpoints. And Over the Garden Wall doesn't just cause you to question its story or characters, it also causes you to question the limits of what a cartoon can do. And in order to really understand that, we're going to have to look at the influences behind this series.
Quite often, Gothic stories will take place in a time before the work was created. This is often used to impart an effect of foreignness to the work, in order to make it more digestible to the audience. While there is no discernible time period in Over the Garden Wall, the realm of the unknown presents itself as a place lost in time. Elijah Wood, the voice actor for Wirt, once stated, "If the show were played on a record, it would be done on an old phonograph," meaning that much of the show's art direction was inspired by artwork and inventions from the early 19th and 20th century. These inspirations include paintings by Gustav Doré and Ivan Shishkin, illustrations by Edward Lear, Harrison Cady, and Childe Harold. Just as a note, this is not to be confused with the character from Lord Byron's Childe Harold's Pilgrimage, though there are apt comparisons to be made between this and the show that I will get to later. It should also be noted that many of these inspirations were famous for their works with classic fairy tales. Gustav Doré was famous for these illustrations of Little Red Riding Hood and Bluebeard. Edward Lear wrote the story The Owl and the Pussycat, and Harrison Cady was illustrating fairy tales very similar to Over the Garden Wall. Though just as these artists were known for their depictions of fairy tales, they were also known for their depictions of nature. Many of these artists, particularly Doré, were part of the Romantic art movement. This movement placed a large focus on nature as a reaction to the Industrial Revolution in the 18th century, where nature would often be depicted with an air of mystery and grandeur. Romanticism is very important to the Gothic, as the two were beginning to come into prominence at about the same time, with many debating which movement was more influenced by the other. And when you look at these backgrounds, it's easy to see the romantic influences that were going into this show. Often, the backgrounds are made to resemble a style of painting called grisaille, which was very common throughout the Romantic art movement, where they utilize a gradient of one color. Though, unlike most grisaille paintings which commonly used grays and blacks for their color schemes, the show's backgrounds instead opt to utilize oranges and greens, emphasizing the colors of fall. Another piece of artistic inspiration from this era comes from chromolithographs. Chromolithographs were mass-produced multicolor prints that began to emerge in the early 19th century as a cheaper means of producing art as opposed to painting. This can also be seen in the backgrounds of the show, where there is this muted quality to the colors throughout the series, similar to the fragile nature of chromolithographs. Good art direction in any visual medium will often help to reinforce the narrative that it sets forth. Utilizing and combining the styles of romantic paintings and chromolithographs creates an interesting internal conflict within the art style. While both came into prominence at about the same time, the two are fundamentally at odds with one another, with Romanticism acting as a rejection for the artificiality of industry which chromolithographs were a product of. This internal conflict within the art style helps to make the world of Over the Garden Wall seem more dark and mysterious, supporting the Gothic narrative while giving it a unique visual identity. Though if there's one aspect of Over the Garden Wall that helps to reinforce the Gothic's use of the past, it is seen in the ways the show pays tribute to the early days of animation. This can be seen in the designs for certain characters, some small references, and even scenes that directly replicate some early cartoons, from the works of Ub Iwerks, the Fleischer Brothers, and Van Buren Studios. The 8th chapter, Babes in the Woods, particularly demonstrates this process, where many sequences directly mirror the early Walt Disney cartoon Alice's Adventures, where many sequences are being similar, if not exactly replicating the original. Another studio that seems to have a clear influence on the show was Fleischer Studios, who were known for Betty Boop and some of the early Popeye cartoons. Though while the Tavern Keeper is comparable to Betty Boop in both voice and appearance, the main influence from Fleischer Studios comes from their use of rotoscope, an invention of Fleischer Studios. Rotoscoping comes from filming something and then proceeding to draw and animate based on the film footage. This technique is used throughout most of animation and film, though when the Fleischer brothers utilized it, it is often used to create a strange and surreal sequence. While it can be argued that the surreal imagery for the Fleischers can be seen throughout the entire series, the musical number for the song The Highwayman specifically emulates the rotoscoping techniques for the Fleischer brothers. In my interview with Nick Cross, he told me, "I had this memory that I kept pushing for a weird Fleischer Brothers style dance number in the show. This sort of animation is difficult to get an overseas studio to do, since it would be a lot of work. So I basically volunteered myself to do it. It was a fun challenge, and it sort of lends a weird mood to the scene."
I'll knock you out, drag you off the road, steal your shoes from off your feet. I'm that highwayman, when I'm making me.
So you have a series that is paying tribute to earlier forms of animation, in a time where quality animation is more expensive to produce, causing the medium to feel more restrictive in its material. Nick Cross once told me, "I grew up in a time before cable TV. Most of the cartoons I watched as a kid were old cartoons from Disney, Warner Brothers, and Hanna-Barbera, as well as public domain cartoons. Since many of these were theatrical shorts, and not necessarily meant strictly for kids, the quality was high, as well as very innovative. There were no rules back then, and they were still figuring things out. So there is a wild sense of experimentation. It makes a lot of sense that a Gothic series like Over the Garden Wall would harken back to a more experimental period of animation, considering how often Gothic literature takes advantage of the past. During the rising prominence of Gothic literature, another artistic movement that was influential on the genre was the growing movement of neoclassicism, which, to briefly summarize, sought to emulate the artistic traditions of past movements, cultures, and civilizations. As a movement, neoclassicism has drawn some rightful criticisms for the ways that it can glorify certain eras of history while ignoring the problems of those eras, as well as the ways that it has been used to cater to reactionary ideologies. Though quite often, the most celebrated and long-lasting examples of neoclassicism do so by using this format to comment upon the era of its setting, as well as the era of its publication. For example, the first Gothic novel is widely agreed to be Horace Walpole's The Castle of Otranto, which was written in 1764. The story presents itself to audiences as a lost manuscript of real events that were written 200 years ago. This set the novel in a time period of Shakespeare's plays and presented it in the same context of Dante's Inferno, highly respected pieces of work both then and now. This use of neoclassicism gave Walpole more freedom when writing this story, since he wouldn't have to be worried about meeting modern literary standards, which resulted in the work gaining legitimacy in a time where novels were considered improper and a low form of writing. Similarly, because Over the Garden Wall combines aspects of early and modern animation, it adds some legitimacy to the show to perhaps older potential audiences. But more vitally, its use of neoclassicism helps to comment upon the cartoons this series takes influence from. For as influential and experimental the early days of animation were, it is foolish to deny that this era suffers from too many oversimplified stories, as well as being beholden to regressive ideologies. So while you are well within your rights to enjoy this era of animation, it's impossible to deny how this subversion of these classical cartoons greatly helps the narrative. Because Over the Garden Wall caters to viewers who might have an appreciation for these older cartoons, it was able to be more accessible for older audiences than other children's shows of today. And because older cartoons had a reputation of being darker than modern cartoons, borrowing the aesthetics of these older cartoons and putting them in a modern context helps to create some of the Gothic elements that we see throughout the series. Though, in order to examine these modern contexts, we will need to examine our main characters. Characters in Gothic literature are usually portrayed within very well-defined archetypes. These archetypes do not only reinforce the narrative, but also the characteristics of the genre. Consider the protagonist, Wirt, and how he takes on a lot of inspiration from two areas deeply rooted in the Gothic tradition. To start off, Wirt embodies many traits of the Byronic hero. The Byronic hero is an archetype based off of the Romantic poet Lord George Gordon Byron, a writer who is remembered as an extravagant, melodramatic, and self-destructive man who was highly influential on both the Romantic and Gothic movement in literature. Based on both his real-world personality and some hyperbolic accounts of him, the Byronic hero is seen as an embodiment of the values upheld within the Romantic movement. Many famous characters in Gothic literature emulate the characteristics of Lord Byron, from Victor Frankenstein, Lorenzo de Medina, the Phantom of the Opera, to even Edward Cullen. These characters are seen as passionate, mysterious, and dangerous. And you can change him. Wirt is very similar to this in many regards. Like the archetypal Byronic hero, he is cultured in the arts, emotionally conflicted, and even charismatic and mysterious enough to have a fair share of ladies gaining affection for him. Alongside this, Wirt is smart enough to be able to identify architecture.
It's like French Rococo style. That doesn't really seem in line with Endicott's Georgian sensibilities.
How? What? Who on earth am I talking to right now?
Should I not know that sort of stuff?
Being incredibly introspective and somewhat self-deprecating.
I don't know. Sometimes I feel like I'm just like a boat upon a winding river, twisting towards an endless black sea. Further and further, drifting away from where I want to be, who I want to be.
And even enough of an artist to create a 15-track tape of poetry and clarinet for his crush, including the music playing in the background right now. It is because of these traits that many find themselves attracted to these sort of characters. One needn't look further than the fan art of him to see that this is definitely the case for Wirt. Though, like many other things within Gothic literature, the Byronic hero has a lot of darker elements beyond their romantic exterior. While they may be intelligent and mysterious, they can also be arrogant and selfish. And while Wirt is a lot less threatening compared to other Byronic heroes, this darker side is still present through Wirt's complicity. Throughout their journey, Wirt is often resigned to whatever fate he finds himself to, while rarely trying to do anything about it.
Greg,
Yes, Wirt?
can we please stop pretending we're gonna get home?
Huh?
Can we admit we're lost for good? That this fog is deeper than we can ever understand. That we are but wayward leaves, scattered to the air by an indifferent wind. Can we just admit we're never gonna get back home, Greg? Can we do that?
Wirt, for a majority of the series, is a bit of a jerk. He is dismissive of Greg, is often of little help, and refuses to take responsibility for his actions. Much of this is in fact a product of his Byronic traits. Because of his intelligence and introspective nature, he is also incredibly self-conscious and is often resigned to the idea that all is hopeless and the best thing to do is nothing, despite how many people come to rely on him. Contrast this with Greg, the younger of the two, and the main source of comic relief within the show. Throughout the two's journey, Greg is often contrasting Wirt's pessimism with the happy-go-lucky innocence, where Greg is often optimistic that whatever situation he is in will turn out okay, even in situations where he by all rights should be absolutely terrified.
You have beautiful eyes.
Though despite this almost ignorant optimism, Greg is a lot smarter and responsible than Wirt and the audience might give him credit for. Greg is able to defeat the wolf, save the school from bankruptcy, help Quincy Endicott, and is ultimately able to outsmart the beast, all thanks in part to his upbeat attitude. With this in mind, Greg has been often characterized, most notably by PBS Idea Channel, as an example of the Kierkegaardian Knight of Faith. This concept is based on the writings of Soren Kierkegaard, a notable philosopher during the same time period where Gothic storytelling was coming into prominence. According to his writing, the Knight of Faith is a character who often has complete faith in all around him, leading him to be a more free and happy individual as a result. Some other examples of this archetype can be seen from the likes of Abraham, the Norse pantheon, and even Charlie Brown, all characters of action that are willing to commit to whatever they do because they have that faith, despite all of the inherent risks. It is interesting to consider this alongside the fact that of all the characters in this series, Greg is the only character that does not receive any substantial development as a character. I suppose you could chalk it up to him being so young or him being a one-dimensional piece of comic relief, but ultimately, I think the reason why Greg is the way he is because he is represented by everything that Wirt isn't, as well as all of the things that he could be if he was willing to open up. It shows that despite the utter hopelessness of their situation, Greg is able to succeed because he is not willing to lose hope in the face of this, allowing him to be a braver, happier, and more caring person than his older brother. And Wirt is only able to progress when he stops seeing his brother as a merely ignorant child. Ultimately, the reason why the two are lost in the unknown in the first place is because Wirt refuses to take responsibility for his actions. Because of Wirt's constantly resigned attitude, he's often left in a constant state of complacency and hopelessness. And this ultimately acts as an internal boundary between Wirt and, quote, where he wants to be and who he wants to be.
It is here where Wirt differentiates himself from most depictions of the Byronic hero, where most either succumb to their fatal flaws or succeed without any consequences. Wirt is able to save himself from this fate, due in part to his second biggest influence as a character, Dante, from the Divine Comedy.
Despite being written a clear 400 years before the Castle of Otranto, it is easy to see how much of a progenitor the Divine Comedy was to Gothic literature. Like modern examples of Gothic literature, the Divine Comedy is also a melodramatic narrative, with constant dark and disturbing imagery and a setting so foreboding it is literally hell. It asks big questions on our views of morality and death, very much in the same ways that Gothic stories would end up doing. It should also be noted that Gustave Doré, one of the primary influences on the show's aesthetics, is also famous for illustrating many scenes from Dante. Like Wirt, and many other emotionally conflicted heroes within Gothic literature, Dante is also intelligent yet arrogant, contemplative yet resigned, and independent yet selfish. Dante also begins this long, contemplative, introspective journey through hell, purgatory, and heaven, after being lost in the woods and finding himself in a strange, unknown realm. Wirt is even called the Pilgrim by many throughout the series, a position that is often associated with Dante. And like Wirt, Dante also begins the story by mourning the loss of his love.
No, though I am lost, my wounded heart resides back home, in pieces strewn about the graveyard of my lost love.
The comparisons between the two continue on, which we will come back to, though the most important comparison between the two is that, like Wirt, Dante is able to improve himself. Dante is also a very flawed individual, similar to Wirt at the beginning, and it is only when he is able to acknowledge and defeat the evil within him that he is able to ascend to heaven and be one with God.
And that's why I think Over the Garden Wall is one of the more sophisticated Gothic narratives to come out in recent years. It's willing to call out Wirt for all of his flaws, and by extension, calling out the flaws of standard Byronic heroes.
Throughout the rest of Gothic fiction, it feels as though there's this need to almost romanticize these flawed protagonists, especially if they are a man. Quite often, any flaws will be either met with a swift karmic resolution for their evil actions, or some quick revelation that justifies all of their previous actions, no matter how imperfect they might be. This leaves little in ways of establishing a middle ground in terms of a character's morality, often casting things into binary distinctions, which is ironic since Gothic literature is often meant to question these very same binary distinctions between good and evil. Though because there is an extreme lack of evil villains or even anti-heroes throughout Over the Garden Wall, the only thing that is keeping Wirt from getting him and Greg home is Wirt's inability to acknowledge his faults and learn how to overcome them.
Learning to accept your flaws is a pretty sophisticated narrative to put forward, especially if your target demographic is children. Though, wait, you might say, if there aren't any villains or anti-heroes in this story, then what do you call the beast? Well, since you asked.
If there's one thing that can be said about the unknown, it is how well it encapsulates a concept called the sublime, a common principle in the Gothic and Romanticism that focuses on the grandeur of nature, where nature is often portrayed as something beyond our comprehension, as if it were something above humanity. Looking at these images of the unknown, there is always this element of greatness and mystery surrounding it. For while the sublime is often a sight to behold, there is always an element of untamed danger behind it. As a result, these sublime locations throughout Gothic literature are often that way, because they serve as an example of man's insignificance when compared to nature. Its wide images of decaying homes, abandoned castles, and deep dark forests are such staples of modern Gothic stories. They help to reinforce how little control the characters have over their situations, reflecting how little control we can have over the world. This focus on the setting, combined with the language of the writer, often leads it to becoming personified in some manner, sometimes becoming a character unto themselves. That being said, the unknown is a strange setting, to say the least. There's no discernible time period, because each new episode has architecture from different eras. Nick Cross even once specifically cited how someone pointed out very early on that doorknobs were a relatively new thing in the 1700s, since they didn't exist, so they had to research what those looked like. If you watch the show, you'll see all the doors have different handles and latches that are all historically correct. The same goes for the fashion, as often the characters' clothing will often date them to wildly different periods of fashion from different areas of the world. Because of the multiple parallels to different locations and time periods, the unknown feels like it is a place not of this world, and that's because it isn't. Like one of Wirt's inspirations, Dante, the two brothers are in fact journeying through some form of the afterlife, with the unknown serving as some form of limbo that only those on the cusp of death may see. Indeed, in the 9th chapter of the series, it is revealed that Wirt and Greg are in fact from the modern era, roughly around the late 80s and early 90s, who are both transported into the unknown while they nearly drown in a river. This is reinforced constantly throughout the series, by the pumpkins of Plattsfield, which sounds similar to Pottersfield.
Say, aren't you a little too early?
What do you mean?
I mean, it doesn't seem like you're ready to join us just yet.
And what about you? You sure you want to leave?
Me? Yes.
Oh, well, you'll join us someday.
By the grave of Quincy Endicott being seen in the background, and even an old Woody Guthrie song about death that plays in the background as the boys fall into the river while dodging a train. As a result, it can be assumed that these long-forgotten stories that were previously alluded to in the introductions are stories about souls that were lost to time. Though it seems here that all of these souls are more or less content with their fates, though the only bad thing which seems to befall those in the unknown is when anyone is found by the beast.
So let's talk about the beast.
Despite the fact that many aspects of this series have been more or less agreed to in their meaning, the beast is one of the most ambiguous elements of the show. There's very little known about his origins. He is rarely seen throughout the series, and the most we really get to see of the beast is from a few frames in the very last episode. From what can be gathered, the beast has no distinct inspiration or influence. Some point out similarities seen between the beast and other figures from literature and folklore, some including traditional portrayals of Lucifer, a ghost from Old English folktales called Herne the Hunter, the Aelith as seen in Lovecraftian stories, and even the Cernunnos of Norse mythologies, all horned beings that are associated with death. Whatever the inspiration, the beast is a horned being whose soul is kept alive in a lantern which is fueled by the oils of the Edelwood trees seen all around the unknown, which later revealed to be made from the lost souls of the unknown. While some say that the beast is an incarnation of death or the devil himself, my interpretation is a little more abstract. I believe that the beast is a personification of the unknown, in the same ways that other Gothic stories personify their settings. Let me explain. In many respects, the souls of the unknown are very much lost like Wirt and Greg, each one trying to find a way to complete their own stories and try to get a happy end. It is only when they begin to lose the will to go on that the beast steals their souls. As such, the unknown as a place is also a place of hopelessness, with many locations depicting the unknown as a place of isolation and darkness. I believe that out of this hopelessness, the beast was formed, and uses the souls of those subdued by the hopelessness of the unknown in order to to strengthen that very same hopelessness. That's why all the residents of the unknown are all strangely enthusiastic all the time. It's a defense mechanism against the hopelessness of the unknown that's required to survive. This idea of the unknown doesn't seem to only apply to the magical woods. It also applies to the problems each character has. Wirt is unable to face the unknown factors of himself, Beatrice being unable to face the unknown of her family, and the woodsman unwilling to accept the unknown of losing his daughter. Each one of these characters is unwilling to face their problems because they are afraid of the incomprehensible. Humans inherently fear what we don't understand. It is one of the most basic survival instincts, though more often than not, things become a lot less scary the more we learn about it. Learning how to face what we don't understand is how we become better people.
Woodsman.
When I first got lost, you told me to beware the unknown. But you were wrong. This place isn't scary. What's really scary is going home and facing your problems. That's the real unknown.
Gothic literature often invites audiences to reflect on that which we fear. Whether it be the evil nature within ourselves, our unknown place in the universe, or of our own mortality. While other Gothic stories will end with their characters succumbing to those fears, Over the Garden Wall has its characters triumphing by giving them hope. Be it hope within themselves, hope within others, or even hope that everything will be alright. Wirt is able to save himself by learning to acknowledge his fears. It is once he loses his feelings of hopelessness, he is able to climb out of that river.
In an age where our media likes to portray its stories in the most dour and dark ways possible, Over the Garden Wall shows us the benefit of rejecting this darkness surrounding us and learning to face the unknown. Thank you for watching. Best wishes.